Welcome, everyone. During the first week in April, when NYSUT's Director of Social Justice, Wayne White, asked me to moderate this event, I leapt at the chance. These are disorienting and frightening times for Jews in America and the world. Jews are long accustomed to violent threats from the political right, from white nationalists, from religious nationalists, from conspiracy theorists. The neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, the mass murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Elon Musk's salute to the AfD party in Germany. These are all plain and unambiguous markers of right-wing anti-Semitism. But lately, candidly, in the aftermath of the Hamas attacks on October 7, Jews like me, people who identify as both Jewish and progressive, find themselves simultaneously confronting escalating anti-Semitism on the left. The attempted killing of Governor Shapiro and his family in Pennsylvania, the murder of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram in Washington, D.C., the flame-throwing assault on Jews in Colorado, these have all emanated from leftists who have invoked support for Palestinians as a pretext for violence against Jews. Put simply, Jews are feeling more anxious, more threatened, and less safe wherever they find themselves on the political spectrum. In February, 3 months before the recent attacks, Rabbi Mark Soloway wrote an open letter to the Boulder City Council. "It's just a plain fact," said Soloway, "that many of us in Boulder's Jewish community simply do not feel safe or supported. Jews in America have mostly felt the threats of anti-Semitism from the far right in the form of white supremacy. Yet now many of us have experienced hatred, bigotry, and intolerance from progressives, those who many of us have considered our friends and allies." Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not an event or a month dedicated to trauma. There is a long, vibrant, affirmative history of Jewish heritage that is entirely independent, even defiant, of the threats that have always confronted Jews. We will hear some of that rich, robust history today. But the events of the past days and weeks cannot help but trigger acute and terrifying memories of trauma. So that is where we will begin. A few prefacing remarks before we start. The anti-Semitism burnt into the minds and experiences of Jews today has a paradoxical relationship with the October 7 assault and the ensuing war between Israel and, depending on your point of view, either Hamas specifically or Gaza generally. On the one hand, today's manifestations of violence and bias against Jews follow some very familiar patterns that arc back decades, centuries, millennia. On the other hand, the recent surge in anti-Semitism is plainly linked to the current war in the Middle East. We are not here to adjudicate that war. We have half an hour, and we would do a very bad job of it were we to try. Today's conversation is part of the TruthTalks initiative from the NYSUT Members of Color Affinity and Action Project and the ongoing Many Threads, One Fabric project. That project seeks to amplify the contributions of diverse communities that have been overlooked in traditional narratives. To that end, we begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we meet on the traditional land served by the First People. We honor America's indigenous people. We learn from all elders, past, present, and emerging. We are called on to share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. We invite you to think about the spaces you are inhabiting and the indigenous people who came before them and were stewards of the land. We also begin with a word from Philippe Abraham. Philippe serves as NYSUT's Secretary-Treasurer, as chair of the Civil and Human Rights Committee, and chair of the LGBTQ+ committee.
Thank you, Greg. It's my honor to welcome you to today's webinar as we recognize Jewish American Heritage Month, a time to celebrate the rich history, cultural heritage, and ongoing contributions of Jewish Americans, especially within the labor and education movements right here in New York. From the sweatshops of the Lower East Side to the front lines of our classrooms, Jewish Americans have helped shape the very core of public education, and organized labor. Their fight for dignity, equity, and justice has never been limited to their own communities. It's been about lifting all working people. We are proud to stand on the shoulders of giants like my brother, Alan Lubin, a tireless advocate for educators, working families, and students across New York State. As a former executive vice president of NYSUT, Alan's leadership was grounded in his deep sense of justice, shaped by his Jewish identity and driven by his belief in the power of collective action. His work helped transform our union into a force for equity and inclusion, and we are all better for it. We also recognize the vital work of leaders today, like Arieh Lebowitz, Executive Director of the Jewish Labor Committee, who continues to carry forward the tradition of Jewish activism in the labor movement. Under Arieh's leadership, the JLC works to strengthen ties between the Jewish community and the broader struggles for workers' rights and social justice, reminding us that the fight against anti-Semitism must always go hand in hand with the fight against racism, xenophobia, and economic inequality. At a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise and its historical amnesia threatens to erase hard-earned lessons, Jewish American Heritage Month serves as a call to action. We must ensure that Jewish history isn't confined to a textbook page or a single holiday. It must be woven into our classrooms, our union work, and our broader struggle for justice. As educators and union members, we have a duty to stand up for truth, to protect all our students and colleagues from hate, and to model the kind of solidarity that leaders like Alan Lubin and Arieh Lebowitz have long exemplified. Thank you for joining us in this important conversation. Together, let's continue to work with memory, with courage, and with a shared commitment to justice for all. Let's begin. Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Philippe. For today's conversation, I am joined by two deeply knowledgeable and esteemed guests. Arieh Lebowitz is Executive Director of the Jewish Labor Committee and has been involved with the JLC since 1985. A native of Manhattan and a proud product of New York's public school system, Arieh has a BA in Judaic Studies from Harper College. He is the author of a number of articles on the Jewish labor movement, including Why a Labor Movement Matters and A Counter-Olympics That Challenged Tyranny, Labor's Response to the 1936 Nazi Olympics in Berlin. Arieh has also co-edited the Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives at NYU as part of the Archives of the Holocaust. Alan Lubin is a former fourth grade teacher from Brooklyn. He served for decades in leadership roles in both the United Federation of Teachers and NYSUT and spent 17 years as NYSUT's executive vice president and head of the union's legislative and political action operations. His work in those capacities helped establish NYSUT as one of the most powerful forces for working people in the state. As the co-founder of the Business and Labor Coalition of New York, Lubin remains active in union issues today, and I will only add that I heard Alan speak when I was around 27 years old, and he made me want to become a union leader. By the way, my name is Greg Perlis. I teach history at a public high school on Long Island. I serve as president of my local North Shore Schools Federated Employees. I serve as a member of NYSUT's Board of Directors on behalf of ED19 in Nassau County, and I work on the steering committee for the NYSUT Civil and Human Rights Committee. Okay, let's get started. First question. For many people viewing this event, the ongoing spate of violent anti-Semitism is top of mind. We all saw the recent terrorism in DC and Colorado. I think all or most of us believe it's emblematic of a longer, wider trend. In your views, why is anti-Semitism on such a sharp rise in recent times? Where is this all coming from?
A few thoughts. To some degree, this is coming from misdirection from political leadership in this country, which is saying that many of the problems confronting people on college campuses and elsewhere are problems that are confronting Jews, and this is how we're going to deal with them. So that is, people are saying anti-Semitism is a serious problem. Here's what we're going to do about it. Another part is, the reality is that there are some people who are anxious about their economic or social position. They want somebody to attack, or they want somebody to do something about it. They're frustrated that other people seem to be doing better off. And this is, as you mentioned, an historic problem. People think, oh, it may be the Jews, or it must be the Jews. And the appropriate thing to do is to hit one of them, which of course will not solve anybody's problems, but will give individual Jews in the Jewish community a lot of problems, a lot of groups. There's another added part of it, that is that people look at headlines, whether it's an attack here in the States or it's an attack over there in the Middle East. There are different attacks in different places. People are frustrated and upset about that also. They want to demonstrate their frustration alongside anger. And for a whole slew of reasons, they figure the thing to do is to attack the Jewish individuals, Jewish politicians, Jews in the street, Jewish institutions, as if in some like that will make the situation better. Of course, I would say it doesn't. But I think that's a big part of it as well. As you pointed out to begin with, there is a very, very old thread of anti-Semitism or uneasiness about ethnic and religious minorities, and the Jewish community in the United States ticks both boxes.
The issue of anti-Semitism is a very old issue and dates back thousands of years. What we've experienced in my growing up in New York City, and by the way, New York has the second largest city with Jewish people. The first is Tel Aviv, and then it's New York. So we have a tremendous Jewish community in New York. And I only experienced very minor. I was working in a camp one summer, and I dated a young lady, and she came back and said, "We can't go out again. My mother said you were Jewish." And that was about the limit. I have not been hit with anti-Semitism throughout my whole life, but I've seen it, and we've all seen it. And we go back to, working in other coalitions, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. But I just want to mention one of the striking beginnings that people became aware of was the temple in Pittsburgh where I think 12 Jews were killed for going to temple. Can you imagine the fear that puts into everybody who participates in Jewish activities in Jewish groups, which we saw again this week? So in that situation, after the killing, the very next week, the Muslim community in Pittsburgh sent people over to stand outside and stand guard to protect the Jews inside. This is not something that we should take lightly. We're not going to solve this problem without involving other communities. And as we have helped many other communities over the years, it becomes critically important to pay attention to that. So I think what we've seen, and other minorities, because of their color, because of their accent, have more evidence of it, but there's more anti-Semitism in the last 2 years than anti-anything else. And we'll get on in the next topic, we'll be talking about why we think that is so common. But I think it's got to be a situation where people learn to work together. Otherwise, we never fix it. And in our situation, it's something that those of you who are watching this, who are Jewish or non-Jewish, we have to support each other, because we're finished if we can't support each other. And that's what's happening now with one group being pitted against another one. So
it's interesting. The current administration thinks it has isolated the problem and has a fix. The current administration's answer to this question is that the principal threats to Jews stem from higher education and from immigration. I'm wondering if one or both of you accept these premises? Do you accept the premise that the challenges to university visas, to immigrants, to curricula, to funding are rooted authentically in efforts to protect Jews?
No, I believe they are rooted to continue the persecution of Jews. I think when you listen to the elected leader of our country, and just yesterday, Joe Biden was blamed for the attacks in Colorado by the president, the current president. And that's a little bit bizarre. I mean, the technical thing was the guy came into the country legally, overstayed his visa, and did what we've all been reading about. But it's very helpful to the president to come out and say, I am fighting anti-Semitism, I'm working with you, and keeping the issue on the table in a way like the first big incident we had where Nazis were walking down the streets, and he said, there are good people on both sides. That's the real message. The message is, I want to keep this on the table because he wants to look like a hero and buy the Jewish vote. And he's not running for office, hopefully, ever again. But his attitude is really, if you keep it out there, I can keep saving by blaming different people for causing all this problem. I believe that his public stance in almost everything he does, we all know he cares about one person, and that's himself. His stance is to keep anti-Semitism on the table and give the people who would be anti-Semitic, open the door for them to come out of their closets and really attack us on a daily basis.
Arieh, what are your thoughts on this argument that's been advanced that the crackdowns on universities are essential to protect Jews in America?
Well, I'll say, regarding your question, and I'll answer ditto. That's a bogus argument. And basically, the president has a variety of reasons for giving, for instance, Harvard University and many other universities or schools of higher learning a hard time. And they have nothing to do with the problems that Jewish students, the problem that Jewish faculty, the problem that Jewish community members have in either real anti-Semitism or perceptions of anti-Semitism. And I suspect that they're not going in any meaningful way. How can cutting off grants to international students who are already processed and on the way to becoming part of the student body, how can that possibly help in the fight against anti-Semitism? No. Cutting off grants to research that's being done at Harvard and other universities around the country, how can that possibly help in the struggle against anti-Semitism, which is a real problem in a variety of places around the United States? So I think that, just like Alan said in a different way, that is, he's using a legitimate concern to promote both his own agenda, which is frankly to stick it to a few universities for reasons of his own, and to make it harder for people from other countries to come to the United States to study and to live in. Simple as that.
We could talk about these things all day, but I do want to acknowledge a kind of wider angle. I said this before. I'm gonna repeat it. It's important not to be a prisoner of the moment. It's important not to be trapped by recency bias, and it's also important not to dwell exclusively on trauma and bigotry. So let's widen the lens. What should people understand about how long Jews have been in America? When and why did Jews become part of the American experiment?
Okay, yes, I'll jump in. I had some prepared notes on this. But let me start off by saying, before we get started on that question, let's take the present for a moment. That is, how many Jews are there in the United States? Somewhere between 7.5 and 8 million of the much larger populations. We're around 2.4% of the population. That means, well, you do the math, the vast majority of people who live and work in the United States are not Jews. And it's important to put that in context, so that, unfortunately, attacks against Jews or prominence of Jews get an inordinate amount of visibility, both in mainstream media and also in social media, which of course is where a lot of discussion takes place, and sadly, back in arenas such as this. But I should say that American Jews have been involved with the American labor movement primarily out of a commitment to improve their lives and both that of their families, as well as their co-workers and communities. This is true from the late 1880s to today. The American Jews are involved in the entire gamut of unions, from the American Federation of Government Employees, the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, to the Writers Guild of America East and West. But first, some history. I love you. The Jews in the United States, even before it became the United States. Portuguese-speaking Jews first arrived to these shores in 1654 in New Amsterdam, near the tip of Manhattan. That is, they were escaping religious persecution in Brazil. There was only a few dozen, but then more Portuguese-speaking and Spanish-speaking Jews seeking a haven from the Catholic Church's so-called Spanish Inquisition came to what was to become the United States. The numbers were small, and although their involvement in the life of the larger communities in which they lived was not insignificant, this first wave of separated Jewish immigrants didn't become a critical mass. And the vast majority of Jews in the United States today come from Wall Street. After that, German-speaking Jews came in larger numbers to the U.S. in the mid-19th century. They too spread across the continent. They tended to be merchants and shopkeepers, and some rose in the professions and in business. And of course, some became teachers as well. But finally, the Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe, known as Ashkenazi Jews, who arrived in the U.S. in large numbers beginning in the 1880s, settled for the most part in the big cities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other places. They tended to be shop workers and retained their strong Jewish ethnic identities. And the vast majority of Jews in the USA today are of Ashkenazi heritage.
Arieh, you are partly telling the story of my family. Both of my parents are first-generation Americans. All four of my grandparents born in the old country, all four of them Ashkenazi Jews from what's now Russia or Poland. So the next part of the story should sound familiar to anyone watching the ongoing vilification of migrants in our times. Jews, like every successive wave of American immigrants, were relieved of some of the acute threats in their home countries, but they were confronted by economic duress, squalid living conditions, and populist xenophobia. I'm wondering about the response, because for an audience built largely of unionists, the next part is instructive.
Okay, in a nutshell, they organized. From the beginning, many of the Jewish immigrants found work in garment trades. Some because they had experience with tailors in Eastern Europe, and others because it was a skill relatively easy to learn. Many of them worked in small shops, even in not so small ones, and many of them were sweatshops. They were sweating labor out of people. Others, including children, did what they did in homes. They did something called piecework. Most earned pitifully meager wages, long hours. And it didn't take long before they began to see trade unions as the means to their economic and social progress. So they saw forming or joining unions as a key way to improve the quality of their lives. And they also formed mutual aid organizations, a prominent one known as the Workmen's Circle. Now it's the Workers' Circle. A little bit for defense, so to speak, but also to provide safe havens for people to do their own thing with people from their own community. I'll give you an example of that within the labor movement. Back in 1888, the United Hebrew Trades was created to help Jewish immigrant workers join existing union locals, and if they were refused, and they were occasionally refused, to form union locals of their own, where like other immigrant workers, they can conduct business in their own mother tongue. And very often, it will also depend on what type of Yiddish they spoke, because people in different parts of Europe spoke slightly different accents, alphabet, and they had different cultural references. And people very often like to stand with people from the community that they came from, not just the larger continent they came from. The American Jewish labor movement was built largely by immigrants, as I mentioned. They were mostly secular Jews. They shared a strong sense of cultural, indeed ethnic solidarity. Most of them spoke Yiddish as a first language. Some received traditional Jewish educations in the countries they came from, and many had also been exposed to trade unionism and radical politics as young activists before immigrating. Some came to the United States escaping political persecution in Russia, Poland, and Lithuania, and those three countries were significant. Only a few steps ahead of Tsarist or imperial police. By the turn of the 20th century, some Jewish activists were arriving with experience of the Jewish labor movement in Europe. And that organization was known over there as the General Association of Jewish Workers in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, formed in 1897. Some Yiddish-speaking radicals came to America to escape the repression that followed the failed revolution in 1905, and they wasted no time in rising to the leadership in the unions that they found here, as well as the U.S. Socialist Party, Jewish fraternal organizations, as I mentioned, and the left-wing Yiddish press. And the press was significant. Alongside the Jewish labor movement, there arose a vibrant Yiddish left-wing press that reflected socialist, social democratic, anarchist, communist, left-wing Zionist trends, and the diverse Yiddish left of the United States of America. And this was a very lively community of readers as well as writers. And to some degree, our organization, the other ones I mentioned, claim their heritage back to that. In a way that can scarcely be imagined today, newspapers and pamphlets played a large role in the lives of working people. Many here, I'll change to a specific historic moment. Many here know about one of the most dramatic and memorable labor events in the early 20th century, the uprising of the 20,000. For 4 months over the winter of 1909 to 1910, Jewish and Italian immigrant workers, mostly women, who made shirtwaists, that is, blouses of a distinctive design, in New York City, led by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or the ILGWU, conducted a general strike against sweatshop conditions, long hours, low pay, abusive supervisors, poor ventilation, and no job security. So they went on a general strike, and it sent the bosses a message. Things were getting serious. With mediation by a young lawyer, Louis Brandeis, was later the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. After 4 hard winter months on strike, the union won in over 300 garment shops. A 50-hour work week, which sounds like a lot, but it was a victory at the time. An end to piece work, so you only get paid by the hour, not by the piece you produce. Equal division of work during slack seasons. When there wasn't that much business that a company was getting, they still get paid a decent amount. A limit on forced overtime, paid holidays, and more. Now, this industry was segmented. There was women's clothing and men's clothing. Each had their own union. In men's clothing, there was another successful strike in Chicago, 1912-1913. And that was led by Sidney Hillman and Bessie Abramowitz, who were leaders of what became the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. Despite these victories, there were terrible setbacks. On November 25th, 1910, there was a deadly fire at a 4-story factory in Newark, New Jersey. 25 factory workers, mostly young women, perished. 6 were fatally burned, and 19 who jumped to their deaths to escape the fire. 4 months later, there was a more well-known terrible fire. On March 25th, 1911, 146 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian women, lost their lives at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, in a garment factory just east of Washington Square Park, that had managed to resist the tide of unionization 2 years earlier. Not what we think of as a sweatshop. It was a relatively modern facility, but without safety features, locked exits, and a floor higher up in the building than firefighters' ladders could reach. Many people died in the fire or leaping from the window ledge to their deaths. Horrified onlookers watched and were unable to help. This is all part of both American Jewish and American labor history, and also New York history. In the 1920s and 30s, other unions with sizable Jewish membership and leadership coalesced among furriers, hat and cap makers, retail and pharmacy workers, clerks, and printers. Most of the printers were printing things in Yiddish, and not only. Within the building trades, the painters became a Jewish stronghold in New York. There were also Jewish, quote unquote, locals, like iron workers, plumbers, and carpenters. The big garment workers unions, the ILGWU and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, with their hundreds of thousands of members, pioneered what became known as social unionism. And for the history of the labor movement, this is important. Social unionism envisioned improvements and a role for unions that went way beyond basic bread and butter issues, wages, hours, and working conditions, and the establishment of pensions. These unions created union-run health clinics, sanatoriums, daycare centers, cooperative housing projects, vacation resorts and summer camps, adult education programs and cultural activities, first in Yiddish and also in Italian, later in English, and the Amalgamated Bank, which is founded by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, which still flourishes today. I don't doubt it. In the garment workers' unions, Jewish women, including Rose Schneiderman, Clara Lundbeck, Rose Posada, Fania Cohen, Pauline Newman, and many, many others, became organizers, in some cases, leading officials.
I was going to just talk about slightly different, but part of it where the unions were not so innocent at the beginning. There were unions that were keeping Jews out. There were unions that would not allow, they didn't want them in. And it was really with the help of the AFL-CIO nationally, or probably the AFL at that time, nationally, to reject the union if they rejected Jews and said that you can't be part of the labor movement if you're not going to embrace the labor movement, the people who are working. So that happened again to the blacks after it happened to the Jews. And again, we need each other to get together to be able to counter that kind of a nonsense that goes on. I already mentioned the press being on the left wing. That's a problem today because the press is hiding. The press is afraid of Trump and they're hiding. So, it's going along with everything that Arieh said, it's history, and we all know if we don't pay attention to history, it repeats itself. So I think it's something that all these little pieces that are coming out today, everybody watching this program should be paying attention to them. We can't ignore them. We have to go back and say, this is what happened 70 years ago. We're not going to let it happen again today. And again, it comes by working in coalitions.
As a history teacher, I plainly agree with you. The labor movement in American history has sometimes enabled and sometimes counteracted some of the worst discriminations in history. But I think we can agree that it's been an aggregate good. The trajectory over time has been that labor has been foundational to making the middle class possible, to moving people upward in whatever version of the American experiment. Labor has been foundational to upward mobility, such as it exists in the American experiment. And that's true of Jews as well. As with so many immigrant groups in America, success of Jews in time moved in large numbers from factory work to professional work. And I want to talk about that transition a little bit. That transition was largely made possible, I'm going to argue, by unions as a foundation and by public education as conduit. So let's move the narrative forward. Where, when, and how did that happen, that transition happen for American Jews?
Before World War II, Jews in the United States began to enter the public school system as teachers in large American cities, a trend that greatly accelerated after the war. This led to a great migration, not geographic migration, but occupationally, of many Jews from working class to middle class jobs with all of that entails. And that's very, very significant. corollary to that is, which is distinctive and possibly unique, is that Jewish workers and Jewish middle class individuals as voters have retained a liberal voting pattern despite having moved up ahead into the economic middle class solidly. It's a joke that Jews are economically like Episcopalians, but they vote like other ethnic groups that are very different economically than they are. I'm trying to attack maybe washing out, but you get a sense of what I'm talking about. Labor historian Ben Raskin, who himself was a staff representative for the Council of New Jersey State College Locals, KFT, he wrote that what is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the immigrant Jewish working class, in the broadest sense of the term, was its desire for education. It began in the sweatshops themselves, where many Jewish workers used their lunch hours, to read and argue over books and newspapers. Immigrants of all nationalities attended night school to learn English, but Jewish labor activists also established study groups, libraries, schools of their own, and lecture programs, first in English and later in English. These were created not just to teach the principles of anarchism, socialism, communism, labor unionism, etc., but also to teach literature, economics, science, and civics. Jews became very interested in civics, but we don't call it enough now, but involvement in the social and political life of the larger country, which they live. And the children of Jewish immigrants overwhelmingly went to public schools, including public colleges, as I did, on the way to professional careers, including teaching and, of course, teaching union organizing. And I should say something about the teachers and teacher unions. Let me mention a few names of Jews who were and are active in teacher unions. Of course, you recognize Randy Weingarten, current president of the AFT. Some may remember Albert Shanker, who led New York's United Federation of Teachers and led the AFT. Sandra Feldman, Shanker's successor in both positions. Jeanette DiLorenzo, founder and leader in the UFT. Fred Nauman, who was active in the UFT, later served as NYSUT Secretary Treasurer. David Hecker, past president of the AFT Michigan. Herb Magidson, former NYSUT Executive Vice President, and Arthur Steinberg, current president of AFT Pennsylvania. To name just a few, made it out a few. It's a long list. And of course, both Greg and Alan were here with us. So, you're part of a long tradition that continues to today, across the country and across the teachers' labor movement.
There is no tradition that I am a part of that, of which I am more proud. I don't belong on that list, but thank you very much. Alan definitely does.
Now you belong there too, because our leadership is only when we work with other people. So
Agreed. Central to Judaism is the concept of tikkun olam, the obligation to repair the world. It's an idea with deep relevance to both the social justice and labor communities. In its best moments, organized labor has been a powerful force for repairing, renewing, and reimagining the world. So let's talk about that. Historically, how have Jews and the Jewish labor organizations fought tyranny and brutality in the world?
well, let me jump into things that have happened in our organization and what's going on in our city. I mentioned earlier that the press is hiding because they're not reporting. Our country has thrived with the press finding most of the scandals over our lifetimes. They uncover the stuff. They are not uncovering now. They're hiding. And the question, I just want to give you a quote that I've used for 100 years with when I speak to new leaders. You could be doing the best job in the world, but if you're doing it alone, you're doing it wrong. We have got to involve more of our people. For example, if you're going to pick at the superintendent's office in a school district, the probationary teacher should not be standing on the superintendent's car with the megaphone screaming, get out and do what's right. The tenured teacher might be the one who stands next to the superintendent. I'm not recommending we stand on their cars. The tenured teacher should be the one to do that. When there are local newspapers, if, you write a letter to the Times or the News, 1 out of 2,000 letters probably gets printed. If there are local publications and there's an issue in your district, we should be reaching out to the local newspapers, and that reach out will come from the individual members or from the schools demanding that they report on some of the incidents that are taking place. We can't and should not hide the anti-Semitism. We should attack it every single time. And if the press doesn't, we should go after the press to do it. And then again, as we form coalitions with other groups, they will go after the press. So that the key is don't hide. We should not be embarrassed or ashamed or afraid to be Jewish. We should be out there fighting these battles, bringing the argument to the people that are not helping us, trying to get them to do it, and doing it as groups, not as individuals.
Just as an aside, Alan, what you're saying is so true. One of the serious challenges now is that in newspapers across the United States that used to have labor reporters, reporters with the labor beat, A, they don't anymore for the most part.
Yep.
And B, fewer and fewer newspapers are being printed. Newspapers are closing, they're going online. It has a very, very different dynamic.
Well,
Very problematic for sharing our concerns.
Yep.
Expressing solidarity means you need to be able to express it. And if there are fewer newspapers or fewer labor reporters, both of those things militate against our being able to do what our job is.
Joe, when I went to Albany, when I moved to Albany from New York City, there were about 30 newspapers represented. There was a big room. It's now an empty room in the Capitol where the newspapers, the press hung out. They are now buying the stories from 1 or 2 people that are up there. So the full knowledge from day one and the investigation is just not taking place like it should be. And that creates even more of a problem, as Arieh is saying. And there are other organizations. Let me just spend a second on the Jewish Labor Committee. What Arieh has done, what Stuart Applebaum has done in that organization, I remember going back to the, I guess it was the early 90s when I said, I was like, why do we still need the Jewish Labor Committee? They were out there to fight the Nazis. The Nazis are gone. Guess what? The Nazis are not. And what Albert Shanker told me in those days was, they're there so they're ready to act when something happens. And you don't have to create an organization, you have to have the organization. And Jewish Labor Committee and Arieh's leadership there has been untouchable. It has been so good. So I'll take this second to thank you and your organization, Arieh.
Well, thanks an awful lot. I deeply appreciate it. And let me give an example or two of just what you're talking about. I grew up in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, the Upper Lower East Side, and my family used to go very often to the Second Avenue Deli at 10th Second Avenue. After working at the Jewish Labor Committee for a while, I learned that it was a unionized kosher delicatessen. Frankly, it was the last of the unionized kosher delicatessens in New York. But while there, I heard word that there's a labor management dispute. That is, to be honest, there were sweetheart deals taking place between the management of the restaurant and the management of the local. And they had new leadership in the local, and all of a sudden they wanted to have serious negotiating. And Abe Lebowitz, who owned the deli, said, very nice, but no. And the workers there wanted to go out on strike. There was a law, it's called a permanent replacement of striking workers. That is, they could go out on a picket line and strike, but they'd be replaced, and who knows when they'd return back. So we scratched our head, and the New York Jewish Labor Committee, the United Hebrew Trades, said, well, why don't we organize a picket line for them? So that way they wouldn't have to leave their jobs and lose their jobs. So we had a picket line outside for maybe an hour and a half or so. We included teachers, we included dock workers, we included a few farm workers, although frankly, there weren't so many farm workers people in Manhattan at the time. We had a variety of signs, a variety of people from various ethnic groups. Irish Catholic friend of mine made a sign of his own. He was the tallest guy there. It was terrific. And then we closed for the day. And then that night, a bleeple was killed. And we decided, all of us, obviously, we have to stop for a week to give his family a week to mourn. And then soon thereafter, the union approached his brother and his widow and said, look, we have to negotiate. And they secured a contract. There are a variety of arenas in which the JLC plays a distinctive role in helping precisely what you're talking about, that it's coalesce other people from the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community on issues that concern the working people. We occasionally get rabbis to participate in a picket line, which is not bad, or to give a sermon, what we would call in the Jewish world a Devar Torah, on the Sabbath or on Labor Day, or other times, Workers' Memorial Day and Emily Day. I disagree with one thing, why do you, Greg? That is, tikkun olam as a concept, I think is relatively new, going back to maybe the 60s or so. And there are a significant number, and you're one of them, within the liberal and progressive Jewish community who see that as sort of a touchstone for why their activism makes sense and a mandate for action. The reality is that the world needs a lot of repair, and it's been broken for a long time. That's why Moses and these guys went out on strike way back when. But I suspect that most of the people in the labor movement, including Jews, do it as a sense of they know what's wrong, they know what's right. They know that we can't do it alone, as Alan said, and that other people need to do it also. So while I expect that this expression, the concept to repair the world is important, and I'd say go in good health, or in Yiddish, isn't the hate. But this is also something that is relevant for other causes besides the rights of workers, improving the environment, dealing with immigrants respectfully, dealing with people who are starving from food deserts across the United States, dealing with people who are starving around the world. And I think for many of the people who are active in these causes today who are Jews, the concept of tikkun olam is relevant. I should mention that some of this is not new beyond the borders of the labor movement. As some people here may know, there were American Jews very actively involved in the formation of the NAACP.
Yep.
That was in the teens, I believe. Were active in helping develop new and strengthen existing historically Black colleges and universities. That included the work of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, who were not trade unionists per se, but they understood injustice when they saw it. They experienced it there, and they experienced it here. Many of them got jobs in those schools because of the universities wouldn't hire them. I know in the world of human rights, American Jews played and still play a significant role. I worked in the 1980s at something called the U.S. Helsinki Watch Committee, which is a precursor to Human Rights Watch. And a surprise, the vast majority of the key people involved in it early on were American Jews. So I'd say, well, we're involved in the entire gamut of the economy, good guys and bad guys. You can find American Jews, including labor union people, in a variety of activities of significance. Sadly, the leader of the labor movement of the Jewish Labor Committee passed away yesterday, Lenore Miller. I noticed that she, in addition to her work as a leader of the Retail Wholesale Department Union, and the Jewish Labor Committee as president, was active in coalitions for Haitian refugees. We're trying to get asylum here during the Clinton years. And if you go all over environmental activism or trying to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor, trade unionists are overrepresented. And very often Jewish trade unionists are there. And unions that either historically or currently have relatively few Jewish workers, but they play useful and important roles. I just want to throw them into the mix.
As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere. is a threat to justice everywhere. I think we can all agree that there's no such thing as, there's no justice movement that is siloed and carried out in isolation, apart from or in contravention of other movements. I want to thank both of you for speaking widely and holistically about Jewish history. I want to thank both of you for speaking widely and holistically about the role of Jews in unionism. I especially want to thank both of you for speaking so widely and holistically about how good-minded people have to work together to achieve good. So thank you to both of you. Thanks for an invigorating conversation. Thanks to NYSUT for recognizing the Jewish experience as part of our ongoing conversation about social justice. And for those of you out there watching, I want to thank you for your service, for your trade unionism, for your tireless commitment to advocacy and equity. Shalom and good night.
Shalom.